For example, if we take a closer look at the harmony, let's just begin by looking at the first 4 bars. Okay, so these opening 4 bars suggest to me the very beginning of a story, almost like a fairy tale with a once-upon-a-time feel about it. It begins to set the scene. Musically, it suggests a quiet and gentle introduction. Let's move onwards now. So from this bar 5 onwards, the scene seems to evolve as it's telling us more about the characters and the storyline. Maybe a slight pause or breath would be drawn before moving into this section. Now let's move on to bar 12. This very uncharacteristic harmony almost sounds like a concern or a warning that suddenly appears. And the following 4 bars seem to explore this. It suggests a tensioning which could allow an ebb and flow in dynamics. But soon after, those concerns seem to vanish and the harmonies seem more relaxed again, which allows for a decrescendo as the tension is released. Now, from bar 20, this is very clearly and perhaps unexpectedly what I would call an onward moving chord, and could be marked with a more forceful approach. But then it soon shifts again into an anxious sounding section over the next 4 bars, suggesting another crescendo. Now, at bar 24, there's no surprises that this anxiety is yet again resolved. However, a clever harmonic trick is that the bass note stays the same under these changing harmonies and continues for 8 bars. We'll call this a pedal note, or we call this a pedal note, not to be confused with the piano pedal, of course. This harmonic technique builds a tension or an expectation, and we're waiting for a resolution to come. A crescendo yet again can imply this, but worth beginning this section very quietly for a more effective dynamic range. It's as if something troubling has happened in the storyline and we're waiting for everything to be okay. Finally, moving on, bar 32. Bar 32, this pivotal harmony indicates that it's not the final story, because that isn't quite the chord we expect for the very end. Rather than this 7th chord is a very good way of indicating that there's still part of the story left untold. And finally, we break away from this incessant melodic pattern and choose a melodic line that outlines the cadence of the chord. Again, over a pedal note, which provides even more tension rather than using typical chord roots. So this very final chord, therefore, is even more effective when it comes and a feeling of well-being is returned. Now, this inevitably cries out for a slowing down before the relief of the final chord is reached. Now, this is my particular interpretation, and I've just shown you what could be described as a romantic approach to interpretation. It's highly subjective because this is how I imagine a storyline. I'm sure there's certain academics that might take umbrage with this kind of approach, but with the greatest respect to scholars, it's not my intention to second guess what Bach was really thinking about when he wrote this piece. I just want to find some meaning in the playing of this prelude and find a musical journey that personally or otherwise I can reflect. Now, of course, we've just touched upon interpretation, but I hope it's given you some insight into how musically interpretation can be approached. Technically, there are a few considerations with this piece. It's very important to keep these semiquavers as even as possible. The crossover from the left to the right hand can sometimes be a challenge. I like to practice both hands staccato. I also like to use a metronome. You may have one at home. We've got one built into this piano. I've set the metronome BPM to 70. Then maybe try holding the very first left-hand note down, the minim, and play the remainder staccato. You could also try a different rhythm. Be careful also with the very last semiquaver on each of these phrases. There can be a tendency for it to stick out. Now, occasionally you may think it's appropriate to voice certain notes so they ring out a little more. For example, bar 20, I like to emphasize this B flat in this C chord, seeing as it's a very different or very definite harmonic shift. Of course, this is essentially just a matter of more velocity on the key, but I also find it helps if I hold that note down a little longer. So the bar beforehand, now, with regards to pedalling, I personally prefer to pedal twice per bar, although it's possible to pedal just once per bar. The resonance will, of course, build more if you decide on the latter option. With regards to the tempo, well, you'll hear many versions of this piece. So really, I believe that the tempo should fit your mood. For me, the crotchet tempo of 70 feels very natural and seems to sit very, very well. If you have a digital piano, it may have other sounds. If so, try selecting harpsichord and try playing without the sustain pedal. Traditional harpsichords didn't have a sustain pedal, so it's a good discipline to try playing without. This particular sound on this digital piano is made more authentic by the lack of velocity response. So no matter how hard I hit the key, the same volume will sound. Now, don't forget, we've only explored the very first of Bach's book of 24 preludes and fugues. The well-tempered Clavier is made up of 48 pieces in total, It was Bach's intention that the student should learn from this entire work. So when the next wintry evening appears and there's nothing on TV as usual, grab a score and a recording and treat yourself to one of the most sublime keyboard works ever written.